Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Panda Props and Costumes channel. Today we are going to be working on C-3PO belly wires. Okay, so this is, I think it's a detail that's often a little bit underappreciated for C-3PO builders, right? So oftentimes people just get the black, rubber, floor mat and throw some wires on there and it's done. So for my specific build, I really wanted to replicate how C-3PO looked in A New Hope. And there's a certain way that the wires hang. So this is just a screenshot from, or a promo shot or something like that. And basically, I want to capture that look, right? So the very first scene that was shot for Star Wars A New Hope was the Droids for Sale scene. And all the wires are way more neat and tidy in that scene than any other scene. And in fact, the wires just kind of get worse and worse and worse as the movie goes on. But at the beginning of the movie, in the Tantive, you'll notice that's supposed to be the first time that we see C-3PO, and his wires are a mess, but that scene was actually shot last, and that's why the belly wires get all worn out. So I'm going to cover kind of how I'm building my belly wire mat. You don't have to do this exact same thing, but a few people have asked, so I hope at least it's helpful, a point of reference, and it helps out with your build. All right, so let's get on with it. All right, so here we are. These are all the supplies that you're going to need for building the wires. At least this is just the way I did it. Again, if you want to do it a different way, that's totally fine. This is just the way that I did it. So just to start off as a reference point, I found this great picture of the original A New Hope wires for C-3PO. And what I did was, through this and a bunch of other screenshots, I went and tried to identify each wire, basically, at least for the front of the costume, because there aren't really great shots of the sides or back of the costume. It just kind of gets super messy back there. So I'm kind of focusing on the front half because to me that's what people are going to see the most. And if you can fill the back sides with wires and stuff, I'm sure people are going to be psyched anyways, right? But I really wanted to capture this specific look. So yeah, I went through a bunch of screenshots and identified the colors of the wires, and I'm going to talk about them in different layers, okay? But before I get to that, I'm just going to get to some of the supplies that you're going to need. So first is I just have some scrap vinyl. I use that. You can use cardboard, like thin cardstock if you want. What I did was I put on my C-3PO shorts and the torso, and I wrapped this around me first, my body, and I didn't know what the shape was going to be, but then I just had a friend basically take a Sharpie and trace along the bottom edge of the, sorry, here, I'm doing it upside down, I apologize, the bottom edge of the torso, and then the top edge of the shorts. And basically, if you leave a couple of inches above and below sort of for some clearance, so when you move around, it doesn't, basically the torso doesn't pop over and reveal the top of the belly mat, right? So if you leave a couple inches, maybe 2.5 inches top and bottom, you should be good to go. What I did after that was I cut it out, made sure that it fit, and you want to be really careful because if your body shape changes over time, you may want to add just like an extra 3/4 inch or something like that, just to make sure you have a little bit of leeway for just body changes, or maybe you wear a different undersuit or something. You just want to make sure there's a little bit of room there, okay? If you're comfortable, if you feel like your torso is not really going to change shape, then just, go with whatever trace shape you have. Then I went and got some of this ribbed black floor mat. So it's this rubber ribbed floor mat, and you can find it at like office supply stores. I got this from like a home reno store many years ago, and it's fairly stiff. Now I know some people say, well, it's not comfortable and let's use silicone and corduroy or whatever. I don't know, I'm like straight out of 1977, so I wanted this stiff shape so that it basically stays vertical the whole time. That's just the way I like it. I kind of, the costume's already uncomfortable enough, so I don't really care about the belly mat. You may want to add a little bit of extra width, like at least a 1/2 inch or something, because you may want to line the inside with some softer fabric. So I'm going to talk about some ways to secure the wires later, and it might, scratch against your body or your undersuit. You might want to cover that with a piece of fabric by spray gluing it. Again, that choice is up to you. So when you do that, every time you do this, it adds to the dimensions of the belly wires. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a sec, but I'm going to go through all the materials. You're going to need heat shrink tubing. Okay, so this is, if you've ever done any kind of electronics or wiring, it's black or whatever color tubing that you slide over the ends of your wire, and you find the appropriate dimension that fits over, you cut it, and then you heat it with a lighter or a heat gun, and it shrinks, and it basically, you know, keeps all the wires tight. So you're going to need some of that. You're going to need a drill, preferably with a slow speed setting on it, okay? I'll tell you why in a sec. You need a hot glue gun. You're going to need some E6000 adhesive. You're going to need some wire, okay? So the two types of wire mainly that I used for all the belly mats is this sort of solid 22 gauge wire, and that's mainly for these skinnier ones here. For the thicker ones, it really sort of depends on what you want to see. So generally, the higher the number, the thinner the gauge, the lower the number, the thicker the gauge, I believe. So, you know, this might be like 18 gauge or something like that. So, again, find what's available to you. You're going to need, in the skinniest one, in the 22 gauge, and I would get solid wire, not stranded wire, because you want that bit of stiffness. You're going to need white for these skinny ones. And for the other wires, you're going to need a mixture of like white, black, red, yellow, and even some blue, which sorry I left in the box over there. I didn't bring it over, but you might need a few strands of blue. So that's kind of the wire that you're going to need. You are also going to need a clamp or an elastic to hold the drill down, the trigger down. I'll show you what that is in a second. Some scissors. You're going to need some Sharpie or Sharpie markers or some paint pens to make these striped wires. You're going to need a couple silicone pads. So I'm using silicone. These are I always have these left over from when I'm doing molding and stuff like that. But I'll tell you why in a second. But if you can get your hands on some silicone, it could be like a baking sheet or a craft sheet or something. Get some silicone. You're going to need zip ties. This is like the smallest size, okay, the smallest size of zip ties. You're going to need black and you're going to need white. And if you want to have the zippers close like the originals did, you're probably going to want a zipper. So you can get a metal zipper, you can get a plastic zipper, it doesn't really matter. You need that to be the length of the longest part of, for me, I'm going to be putting the zipper in the back, in the middle. On some of the other suits, it was actually on the side, okay? So it depends if you want your zipper visible or not. If you want it to, whatever, be more original to some of the versions of the belly wires, that's a shorter length there on the side, okay? Yeah, so that's basically it for the supplies. So before I get into starting it, I want to talk about sizing. So I made a dreadful mistake once. I made a beautiful set of wires, and I made all these bundles like really thick, and I had nice like, you know, greeblies and things on it. And by the time I got like my shorts and my fiberglass torso, I had TK409 parts at the time, I just didn't account for like how things would increase my torso. And I have the same waist size as Anthony Daniels. I thought that would be fine. Maybe I don't. But just for whatever reason, things didn't fit. And I really didn't take into account the fact that when you make a bundle of wires, especially when you have like one bundle on top of another bundle, you know, you could be adding like, you know, almost a ½ inch thickness just for that one bundle. And if you got a bunch of those all the way around, you're gonna, again, just increase that dimension. So make sure you have your C-3PO shorts and your torso. Obviously you're gonna need that to make this template, which I talked about how to trace those shapes. Just, you know, it's kind of one of those things where it's chicken before the egg or egg before the chicken. Don't make the wires until you have those other parts, okay? So the next step that I did was I made sure that this sort of rough template fit my body, and then I transferred it to, you can see I just traced it with some silver or gold marker there onto the ribbed matting, and the matting has to have the lines going horizontally. And then I cut that out, and I left a little bit extra there. I left about 3/4 of an inch just in case I need to mess around with it or dimensions change for now. So now I've got basically the base for the mat. What I did next was, using the reference, which is this one here, I made this diagram, and I'll put a link to the diagram so that you guys can get you can access it for reference. And this was just a lot of time, again, spent either looking at this or other screenshots and figuring out where all the different colored wires, how many wires there were. This is a very neat diagram. All the wires go up and down, but you can see it's sort of somewhat haphazardly put on, and by the time you start wearing it and moving around, things shift around and they change. But I want my front of my belly wires to look exactly like this, so that's why I made this diagram. And if I want to talk about this for a second, I'm going to talk about the wires being in several different layers, okay? So you've got your rubber belly mat, the floor mat. The next layer of wires is going to be these really thin striped ones, okay? And I'm going to show you how to make those. I would say the next layer would be any sets of wires that are smaller than a bigger bundle, okay? So they might be you know, twisted or braided wires like this. They might be smaller bunches, which might only have like 4. You know, there's just a few in the diagram that are just smaller bunches. Maybe they might be pairs, that kind of thing, okay? That's kind of the next layer. Then the last layer, or there's one more layer on top of that. The next layer is what I call the bundles, okay? So these are like the bigger bundles of wires. So these are like, I'm gonna call them kind of like licorice. That's almost what they look like, right? But these sort of licorice loops. These bundles are much thicker. They generally have, you know, 6 to 8 strands woven into them, and they take up a lot more space. So that's kind of the next layer. The very last layer would be these wires here, these white ones, which have the brass belly pistons on them. So they don't really do anything. I even asked Don Bees, you know, who worked at Lucasfilm on R2-D2 and C-3PO. I'm like, what are those for? And he's like, you know, originally they had them on there because they thought that they needed to hold the shorts up, kind of like suspenders. And they're actually, you can see little attachment points on them there. After a while, it became more trouble than it was worth, okay? So these belly wires actually ran up to black suspender, or sorry, they acted like suspenders. They went over the shoulder and then around a felt yoke that he would wear over his shoulders. So it's kind of like that, right? There'd be a pair of wires going down the front, a pair of wires going down the back, and they apparently held up the shorts. But after, you know, wearing it, they realized it was kind of pointless and they didn't really use them in that way. So later, they were just more decorative and actually part of the belly wires themselves. They were just more decorative. But that's kind of the last layer. So moving on to how to actually make the wires, okay? So again, I started with the stranded ones first. Now, if you have ever worked on a car or any kind of piece of machinery or something like that, I'll try to show these to the camera a little closer so you guys get a good idea. You'll know, obviously, you'll run out of colors of wires. So, I mean, there's wires running all through a car. So how do you tell which is which? And oftentimes they will have these sort of striped or banded wires. Now, you can attempt to go and find them if you want to. I just came up with a super kind of easy and silly way to make them, which is you take a drill, okay? You put it on your slow setting. You put your wire in there. And you basically close the chuck around the wire, all right? And this might be a little bit noisy, and I'll try to just zoom in here for you a little bit so you can see. What I do is I take a clamp or something, and I basically hold down the whatever trigger of the drill, okay? And then as I'm doing that, I'm going to use my paint pen or my marker to just hold it along the wire as it spins around, and then it's going to start to make the banding marks. And it's totally okay that they're irregular and stuff, right? Like, but I mean, it's going to work out. It's fine if some are more evenly spaced. It's fine if some are wider apart. Doesn't really matter. So I'll just show you. So clamps down. Again, it's on the slow speed. Oops, I didn't quite catch the trigger button there. There it goes. Okay. So again, take my marker, zoom in a little bit here. Okay, and I just go like this. Okay, like that kind of deal, right? And then you just do that all the way up and down the wire. You see that there? Yeah. Okay, so I'm just doing it kind of messy. Sorry, I don't have my reading glasses on, but you get the idea, right? So that's basically how I did that. I did that with all of the wires for all this sort of base layer. And again, you can just refer to the diagram for how many wires you might need for the front of the belly mat. And then if you want to, you can, it is something I'm going to do. I'm going to put a whole bunch on the back side as well too. Okay, that's how those wires, particular wires, are made. The next set of wires is that sort of like intermediary set, right? So basically, I referenced the diagrams, and I just started putting bundles together of what those wires were. So some of them were, in the diagram, I've indicated them as straight lines because if I braided them, you might not be able to see them very well. But some of them, like for example, these red and white ones underneath, they're actually ever so slightly twisted and overlapped, okay? And what I do is I will sometimes just, kind of give them a twist, whatever colors they are, and then I will put some heat shrink tubing on the ends, maybe like an inch or so, and heat shrink tube it, and then it's pretty much good to go. And what I'll do is I'll figure out where they're all going to go first, and then I will measure how long that wire needs to be, cut it, heat shrink tubing on, you're done. Move on to the next set, right? So yeah, I did that for all of the sort of what I would call kind of like the smaller wires. One trick that I'll show you, which is again back to the drill, is that if you need to do any kind of braiding like this, okay? So a really simple trick is to take your drill, open up the chuck, and stick two of your wires in there, both of them together. And I mean, I'm sure, I don't know, maybe like electricians or like car stereo installers or somebody does this. I can't be the only person to have done this. But you put both wires in there, you tighten up the chuck, maybe increase the speed a bit, and then all you do is you hold the end of the wire, where's my hand? You hold the end of the wire, and then you squeeze the drill, and you see that? Okay, and it puts a nice, perfect braid together. Okay, now something to keep in mind with that is whenever you're doing that, you want to start with a longer piece of wire than you actually need, because as you braid it together, as you twist it together, the wire is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter, okay, because the extra length is taken up by the twisting. So just be careful with that if you're doing that intermediary set, okay. And then yeah, the last set is sort of the bunches, right, these licorice bunches. So again, what I did was went back to the reference, figured out where those wires were supposed to go, and then just start putting those bunches together, okay? So when I got to these ones, when I did these intermediary ones, if it's like 2 or 3 wires, it's no big deal. I just put some heat shrink tubing, and then they don't take up a lot of bulk. They're not very thick. The problem is when you start doing these kind of big licorice strands, there could be like 6, 7, 8 wires together, and that thickness starts to bulk up really fast. Now that's fine when it's in the belly area, but if the, at least for me, I found that if the ends of the wires were that bulky at the top of the torso or at the bottom where they go into the shorts, it takes up a lot of space and it could start digging into you. It's kind of uncomfortable. So this is a really simple trick that I came up with. I'll zoom in a little bit here again, where I glued the ends together, okay? And I basically, instead of like 6, 7, 8 wires in a round bunch, I flattened them out, okay? And what I did was, this is where the silicone mat comes into play. I would take a silicone mat and I would pump out like a generous bead of hot glue. I'd flatten out the wires, okay, with just my hands. And then I would put it in the hot glue and then take the other silicone mat and then squish them, okay? And then when that's cooled, you kind of get this sort of like blobby pancake, okay? All right, so the wires are now trapped in there, they're encased in there, and then it's really easy to just take your scissors and trim off what you don't need. Now, what I would suggest doing is just leaving a little bit extra, you know, I don't know, like a 1/4 of an inch or something of just around that kind of the base of the wire, okay? And this is now a fantastic base to glue onto the rubber belly mat. Now, I have used hot glue. I made one set of belly wires once, and hot glue held, you know, fine. But over time, hot glue, you know, it's hot glue. It's not the world's strongest material. That's where E6000 comes into play, okay? So glue the ends onto your mat using E6000, and E6000 is a contact cement. So what you do is you spread some onto your wire thing, smooth it out with a popsicle stick. You spread a bit on the base or the belly mat, and you spread it out with a popsicle stick as well. And you leave it. You actually leave these spots for like 5 minutes. So it's a contact adhesive. Like when you go to the shoe repair shop and they're like, they use that smelly glue like barge cement. That's a contact cement too, but E6000 is similar. It doesn't dry or cure as quickly, but you need to let it tack up. So you leave it for like 5 minutes or so, then you join the parts together, and then you could put a clamp or a weight on there. Maybe you can use like little bulldog clips or little clamps, but once that's on there, that's gonna be super solid, okay? It's not gonna come apart. So that's why I would use the E6000. So again, using the reference, go through and figure out what all your bunches should be. I'm not going to go and indicate like how many wires go in each one. I'm sure you can figure that out, but basically it's 5, 6, 7, 8 wires, right? And then some of the bunches, of course, have zip ties on them. So it's full on in the picture. You can see black and white zip ties. So using that as reference, wrap your zip ties around. And then after I had them all coiled together, then I would bend them into the shape that would match whatever was in the diagram, right? Or whatever was in the photo. You might be wondering about these little silver kind of wire grommet greebly things. I don't think anybody has any idea what they are, even in the original. Remember in the original movie, they just bought like, dump trucks worths of old aircraft equipment and junk and salvaged, stuff out of the garbage, basically. So, I mean, these could be some weird, like, World War II era airplane parts or something, but we have no idea. So for these nice little silver things, I had a box of like coaxial cable connectors, and I cut the flange part off that's threaded so that it's just this collar, and I basically just put them over the wires, and they look kind of more or less like some of the little ones that you see throughout the sort of licorice bundles. Okay, so yeah, I just went and started making a bunch of those, and then I started making some extra bunches. So extra of the base wires, extra of the intermediary wires, and extra bunches, so that not only did I have ones for the front, but I had ones for the sides and the back. Okay. And one way to kind of figure out, once you've kind of got them, you don't even have to necessarily make them first. This is just a trick to kind of lay out your wires. What I did was I marked a center line vertically of kind of the exact middle of the, waist. And that basically falls right here in the diagram, which is, it falls right under the belly circle, okay? So just as a rough reference point, there's these black, blue striped wires that roughly fall kind of in the middle, right under that belly circle, right? So, I mean, that's a great reference point to start. So if you take your black, blue wires and you start to lay them out, that's where that one's gonna go. And it's just a very good reference point to start from. What I did then was I took once I made that center mark, and you can also get that center mark by just folding this in half and then making a mark here and drawing a line. I did it again. I folded it in half again, so I quartered it and drew a line. And then that gave me the left and right sides, okay? So again, this to me is what's important about when people see C-3PO, and especially the New Hope version, is that this portion looks like this. At least to me, I want it to look like that. So this is where those sides are. Those are the sides right there. So any wires that you see going out towards the edge, they need to, make sure that they go to this point. I'm not going to bother giving dimensions for this because, oh, this wire has to be 3 inches away from the center, because you might be a different waist size than me, right? You might have 3D printed your shorts. Your waist size might be 3 inches bigger than mine. Stuff's going to move left and right to fit. So it's better if you figure out where your own center line is and where the sides are, and then that way you can start laying the wires out, right? So once I had that, yeah, I would basically start putting the base wires on first. And that's these coiled ones, or sorry, these striped ones. Now, how I did it, and I'm not going to demonstrate it right this second because it's a fairly involved process, is I would either put a dab of hot glue at the top and pull it straight at the bottom and then glue them down like that. You can also use like CA glue, right, with a little bit of accelerant on it, a zip kicker to accelerate it, and that's just to get them in place, okay? Now, if you actually look at the reference photo of the actual photo, you'll actually see, even on some of the, on almost all the wires actually, there are loops of black thread. So I think some poor soul who made the original belly wires went in and like hand sewed little little just thread, needle and thread kind of loops over certain points so that the wires wouldn't like bunch out and stick out, okay? That's kind of another thing that I see a lot of the 3PO builders, you know, they attach the wires, but then they don't really care about the middle, and then everything starts sticking out, and it doesn't quite look right to me. So I would do that where, now you can hand sew it if you want. On the first set of belly wires I did, I actually was able to machine sew right through this rubber belly mat. So I just set the spacing a little bit wider. I held the wires down, I had black thread, and I just had the machine do like a very tight zigzag stitch. So like 5 or 6 stitches in the middle, you know, one here, done, right? And then what I did was I put a drop of CA glue on each of those bundles of thread, and that like locked it down forever, and it was never going to come apart, right? So that's how I secure the base layer wires. For the intermediate wires, that's like sort of these like smaller coils and stuff like that, or smaller bunches. Very similar way. You know, I don't have, I'll talk about the bigger ones in a second, but very similar way. So I would either put a dab of hot glue or CA glue on the ends, and then same thing, I would do the wire sewing. Now, if the stack of wires is not too tall, you can use a machine. If it's too tall, you're not going to get the sewing machine. The needle's not going to go, this is too thick of a material for it to go through, right? So you're not going to be able to machine sew those. If the wires were particularly troublesome, what I actually did was I would poke a hole and I would take some thin black wire, so maybe like 24 gauge, this is not 24 gauge, but some thin black wire, and I would actually make a little loop like this. Okay, I would just make like a little loop like that, okay? And I would put it over the wire into the 2 holes, and then in the back, I would like actually like twist it shut. Actually, let me correct that. I actually did it through the back side, okay? And then I would twist it, and then I would tuck the side in sort of under or next to the wire. And you know, with a 24 gauge or 28 gauge, whatever, super thin wire, you're not really going to see that, right? And again, you're only doing it at certain points to prevent it from kind of bulging outwards, right? So that's another trick to keep the intermediate ones down. Now, when it starts to get to these bigger loops, this is where you're going to need to you think about your attachment points, right? So we talked about that hot glue trick, making these sort of little, I don't know, platforms or whatever you want to call them, right? So now that you have them in place, you've got the reference lines for how this is laid out, you've got your reference photo, you can now, you know, figure out where the position of these is going to be. So once I figured out where those were, again, E6000, right? So I would E6000 on the base of these, E6000 on the mat, clamp it down, you know, bulldog clips, whatever, and then that was good to go. And same, if this was, you know, for this particular one, you don't want it like totally sticking out like that, right? So I would do that looped wire trick that I talked about. You don't have to do it all over, you just need to do it at a couple points, because once this is coiled, once you bend this into shape, it's going to keep its shape. You just don't want this like flapping around or snagging on anything, right? So you know, I would, yeah, put them down like that. And then now you can start to think about each of the strands and which way, you know, they're supposed to be oriented, right? So, you know, sorry, I'm doing this upside down. So I'm trying to like, you know, is it this way or is it this way? Something like that. You know, basically start to kind of lay out your wires and figure out where each of these loops are going to go. Okay, I know this particular one over here in the diagram, it's actually got one strand of yellow in it. So this is like, you know, the bottom. So maybe it's like this or something, right? So like that, you know, that's kind of like the signature look right there, is like that is capturing kind of what the front of this is going to be. Be really, really careful too of the order of these, okay? So you see I got this one, which is this bundle right here, okay? You know, you want to make sure that you get your overs and unders correct, okay? So for this particular one, I know that this one was under, you can see I drew all these lines because I was trying to sketch out like where everything was going to go. That one's going to go under, and then this one's going to go on top like that, right? So you can see this loop right here goes over the white wire, right? So again, I'm being super anal retentive about the whole thing, but you're probably watching this because you're interested in how, and you're probably super anal retentive about this stuff too. So that's basically how I did it. So once you do that with the front all the way up to the sides, I would just make up the rest for the back, okay? Again, using the base layers, using extra bundles that you've made, you know, and again, another thing that I sort of see all the time is people just putting them straight. At least for A New Hope, they were not straight. They were really curved and bent and stuff. So I would just try to do that, kind of add that little bit of character to each bundle of wires. One trick that I did on my previous set, and I will do on this set as well too, is let's pretend that all the wires are on, it's all good, everything's glued down, is I installed the zipper, right? So what I did for the zipper was I actually sewed the sides of the zipper to some, I think it was like maybe 1.5 inches of elastic or nylon webbing, and then you know, or Velcro, right? And then you could Velcro it onto the inside of the belly wire. Now that gives you a little flexibility because since it's Velcroed, you can kind of move the zipper left or right if your torso changes shape. If you don't want to, you can just like sew it, or sorry, you can glue, after you've sewn this to the webbing or the elastic, you can glue it right onto the mat. And again, if you don't change body shape, then that's totally fine, right? But again, sewing that to a strip of, sewing this to a strip of hook Velcro, and then gluing loop Velcro on the inside of the you know, the closure of where the belly mat's going to be. That'll give you just a little bit of flexibility to move the zipper. You know, even if you can get that back closure to close like an extra like inch, that might make the difference for you, right? Or you know, you put it on, you haven't worn it in like 1.5 years. Uh-oh, you put it on, and there's suddenly a gap. You can't close the zipper no matter what you do. Well, if you had the zipper Velcroed, you could at least adjust it 1/2 inch each way and get that extra inch of adjustment, right? So. Yeah, and that's basically it. If you feel that the wires are poking you, another thing that sometimes happens, I mean, obviously because it's a rubber belly mat, it does get quite hot. If it gets sweaty, that's where the advantage of maybe gluing an extra piece of fabric on the inside of the belly mat might help. So provides a little bit of comfort, is a little bit softer. You can use like either a spray adhesive or barge cement to basically glue the fabric to the backside of the rubber. It just, you know, it absorbs a bit of sweat, so you know if it gets sweaty in there, you can at least like wash that down and it's going to be fine, right? Nothing's going to fall apart. So anyways, I hope that helps you out in terms of materials. It's a big job. I mean, you know, people have asked me to make these for them, and I'm like, no. No, I sold one set of belly wires, my original set way back, and you know, the new owner is super happy with them, but I'm like, I'm not making another set because it's a ton of work. It's just a ton of hand labor to get all this stuff together. But so hopefully this will be the last set that I ever have to make. But I hope that helps you out. Again, I will put this diagram online or in the link in the show notes for you so that you can copy those if you want to. And I will also make a template of my particular belly mat. So if you want to copy that, that's, you know, you can use that as well too. One more thing I just forgot, on my particular belly mat, you can see even though the belly circle dips lower, I left this extra little bit here. I didn't like cut it like super close. And that's because the belly circle goes right here, and I may be putting a speaker with a little housing in that area. So as I'm routing my wires, I'm actually going to route them like so that you're just going to find that you're going to run out of room unless you're uber skinny, which I feel I already am. You know, to avoid that extra bulk, you know, wires overlapping, I'm going to have it so that the wires are just like scooched a little bit so that there's a little bit of room there for that speaker housing. And then even as I move, you know, it's not going to like obstruct the movement, right? Like I'll just be scooching the wires a bit just to clear that little bit of space. But I just wanted that extra belly mat, material there so that the speaker could, rest up against it. It wouldn't pop over, it wouldn't overlap or anything like that. So that's, if you're wondering why it's like that, that's why it's like that. Anyways, I hope that helps you out. All right, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it, and we will see you next time. Good luck on your belly wires.